Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the first episode of the Hyperbolic Wine Chamber, where I train my ability to complain. I am Tom Oliver, and today I'm going to be drinking Red Bull, because I'm at work, and that's the best wine I can have here. The Red Bull was donated by myself, or technically by the wonderful taxpayers of Massachusetts, because I got it with my EBT card, because I am that poor. If you would like to donate to the wine fund, the link is in the description to my PayPal, and by all means request a specific wine in the text field, and I'll do my best to track that wine down and drink during an episode of the Wine Chamber, and of course I will mention you in the show notes. So today we are going to be talking about art versus critique, and I guess this is a bit of a follow-up to the recent, as of this recording, Procrastinators podcast episode. I don't fucking care because it's late. It's currently 12:37 a.m. and I'm only half an hour into my shift at work. So I've got a long night ahead of me, and this is how I've decided to pass the time: is to do the first recorded, but probably not the first aired episode of the Hyperbolic Wine Chamber. So we're going to talk about art versus critique, and a couple other kind of retorts and rebuttals and points talking about the latest episode of the Procrastinators podcast. I will link it in the description if you have not watched it. I suggest you watch it first, but you don't have to. But of course, if you're watching this, you probably already have seen it, so for most people, it's fucking fine. I wanted to start with my definition of art, because the podcast kind of was centered around art mediums that we don't respect, or art mediums we think are lesser, or like the tier list or hierarchy of artistic mediums, and the conversation kind of had its ups and downs, and there were points that everyone was making that I was kind of agreeing and disagreeing with, so I'm going to try and kind of go into that a little bit. But first, I just want to kind of lay the foundation with my definition of art. And I kind of have two definitions, sort of. There's like the literal definition of art, and then my personal definition of art, and I will try to explain what that means as well. So in terms of, if you were gonna say Tom, what is art? Like, if that's your question, I would use Scott McCloud's definition of art. Ever since I stumbled upon it, I think it's, while I may not personally sit down and describe everything within its context to my personal beliefs of what art is, I think when soup comes to nuts, I can't disagree with it, so I'm going to say that literally everything that falls inside this definition of art. And his definition of art is anything that isn't done for survival or procreation counts as art. And that's a super fucking wide, huge gamut, but I think, if anything, YouTube and just the internet in general, and things that have become monetizable and have become art forms, I think the definition really holds true, that things that, even 20 years ago that we probably never would have considered artistic or a pursuit that had artistic merit, have been proven wrong. Even if I don't personally agree that some of these things I would consider as artistic, I think are still art. So there was it's in, I think it's in Understanding Comics, the book that Scott McCloud drew, because Understanding Comics and Making Comics and Reinventing Comics are a trilogy of books that he made that are comic books that deconstruct comics as a medium. They're really good, even if you don't read comics or don't care about comics too much. I was just kind of thumbing through them anyway because they're really interesting. But at one point, he has these panels that describe what he believes art to be, and it's this caveman running around, and he's saying the caveman has three main goals: is procreation, finding a woman because it's a guy, a woman to procreate and have a child with because that's kind of programmed into his primitive brain. Seek shelter from the elements, and acquire food and drink to sustain his body. Those are the three things that instinctually drive all living creatures. And his desire to survive. And he's being chased by a saber-toothed tiger or something to that effect. And he's running and running. He's he's trying to survive this encounter. So he runs to the edge of a cliff, and then he jumps up on a tree branch that's overhanging the cliff, that the tiger leaps at him and falls off the cliff. And it's this was entirely an exercise in this man's desire to survive. There's no art in here. So what does he do next? Does he find more food? Does he seek more shelter? Does he try and court a woman again? But instead, he kind of sticks his tongue out at the dead corpse that's I guess off camera, but not really camera. And then it's just, the next panel just says art. Something as simple as that. It had no practical application in this person's life, but it was a self-expression devoid of necessity. That is art. So I would say, as a baseline, kind of like anything that isn't done out of survival can technically be considered art. So even if I don't personally deem it worthy of artistic consideration by my own personal standards, I would say that that is a true enough kind of like factual, objective definition of art. Now, in my personal opinion, what do I consider art? That's much more nebulous. It's kind of much on a kind of a case-by-case basis. Like, you present me with something, and like, do I find it worthy of my own personal artistic consideration? It's more nebulous, I guess, to really define. Now that I'm trying to actually sit down and like kind of spin it into a sentence or two, I don't think I can. It really is just, there are definitely certain things. It's tough, because like, to go back into the main idea of what the podcast was talking about, like, what is art and what are my tiers? I definitely have a personal tier list of things that I respect more in terms of their artistic merits versus other things. However, something that was done consistently on the podcast that I don't know if I'm really understand, and this is a podcast that I really wish I was in on, but I was at work, so I couldn't really do it, is that there were these tier lists that were being mentioned by some people, but I don't know if they were like trying to present them as objective fact, or if this was just personal opinion being confused with it, because Ben was saying some stuff. I think Hippo mentioned a couple things. But those are personal opinions. Like, I could give you a tier list of like things that I appreciate more than anything. I think animation's probably at the top. Then it'd probably be books, then comic books, then video games, and things like modern art and abstract art and like analysis and things would be at the bottom in terms of things that have artistic merit. But that's not a tier. It's not like an objective tier list. That's not something like these are worthy. This is just my interpretation, my appreciation of these mediums in terms of ascribing them personal artistic values. Objectively, it doesn't mean anything. And I guess that's kind of like the problem, right? Because like, where does subjectivity end and objectivity begin, or does it ever begin or end? I need to actually have some of my wine, my quote-unquote Red Bull wine. There we go. So, where does one begin and another end? And another thing that that Jesse said that I agree with very much, and I was itching to bring up, sitting there listening to the podcast until he brought it up, was that pieces of work are not necessarily confined to the slot that they reside in. And what I mean by that is, like, let's say I think personally that I feel that animation is a more powerful and more artistically impressive to me medium than video games. Undertale is still way more impressive artistically than a lot of animation I've seen. Like, nothing is bound by its tier list. It's not like the worst animation is still more artistically valuable to me than the best video game. There's definitely some overlap there, and that's why I think that the tiering doesn't really mean much. It just kind of says to me that, like, if you mention the medium offhand, like, I have a certain amount of respect for it just from my personal experience. As someone who's written books, as someone who's attempted animations, as someone who's attempted and failed miserably at making games, and as somebody who's done illustration and podcasting, like I've dabbled in a bunch of different things. There's subtle nuances to each medium that need to be understood and appreciated in order to do them effectively. And I'm not even going to begin to pretend that I'm a master at any of the fields I've ever attempted to do. Even this podcast, I'm probably doing a mediocre job at best. But there's mastery in every field, even in things that I particularly revile, or not even revile is too hard a word, things that I don't find much particular personal interest in, things like abstract art, like the Jackson Pollocks and the Cubism and shit like that I just find boring and uninteresting and vapid personally, aren't boring or vapid to other people, and aren't boring and vapid objectively. At least I don't think so. Like, what does the objective value of art really mean? And like going back to a specific example from the podcast itself, with pornography. Is a lot of porn empty and baseless? Well, sure. Like, it's kind of manufactured to be low-hanging fruit because it's appealing. It's art that's made for the primitive mind instead of the intellectual mind. And that sounds really, like, fucking pompous when I say it out loud. But it's true, right? Like sexual desire isn't really a refined, intelligent aspect of humanity. It's very, like, going back to the caveman example of how I defined art, it's something that's been there since the inception of mankind. And to appeal to that, you require very little, because it's not a very complicated emotion. You want to fuck somebody. So to make art that stimulates that part of the mind doesn't really require a lot of intellectual depth, a lot of creative endeavor. Like you see someone hot, you want to have sex with them. It's kind of like that emotional kind of visceral reaction. So pornography, to be an effective form of art, doesn't really need to be all of that crazy complexity. Like it's more complicated to stimulate your intellectual desire or intellectual appreciation of like a love story, having two characters fall in love with each other and sympathizing with their kind of emotional plight. It's a much more complicated thing to do than to stimulate the primitive mind of like, I have an erection and I want to fuck something, I can jerk off to this. It's a simpler desire. So pornography, I guess, as a result, is a much simpler art form. Is it still art? From my technical definition, yes. From my personal definition, I think it's probably lower rung if I was going to rank it in terms of things I appreciate artistically, but I'm never going to deny that it's not art. Pornography in any medium is still a subsection of the medium itself. So like if someone's drawing like a pornographic image, it's still a drawing and has all of the artistic merits of drawing as a medium. Same with as a film, same with as a comic book, same with any of that stuff. Like, it's all using the same techniques that if you replace those drawings of fucking with drawings of anything else would still be an art form. So, well, so it's not really the structure of pornography that makes it less desirable or less valid as an art form. I think it's the goal that turns a lot of people off, ironically, by just existing to turn them on. Because it doesn't aspire to much more than that, right? Like, the typical plot of a porn, the stereotypical, pizza delivery guy comes, I can't afford the pizza, can I pay with something else? Like, that's about as complicated as porn plots tend to get. But then again, Jesse made a good example with Alan Moore's Lost Girls taking pornography to a whole other level. That was done intentionally. So, it's like, how much of pornography being unexplored as an art form is because of culture? Because culture really is still kind of on the fritz when it comes to porn, and human sexuality in general is still something that's very private. I think probably with good reason, for the most part. I don't think we need to be super Puritan about it, but sex is a private thing, just by nature of what it is. Do I think there's more room in social commentary to address it more, to be more open about it? Of course. I think we've made large strides in the last, even 10 years of kind of normalizing this talk and just understanding of sexuality, because it's a huge part of humanity. And again, it's very ingrained in the human mind. So I think artistically, there's definitely more room for pornography to become, to kind of move beyond its stigma. I don't think it needs to be as stigmatized as it is. But I think, like I said, because it's trying to stimulate a very primitive part of the human mind, it doesn't have to be very complicated in order to be effective. So that's what I got on pornography. I got a couple of notes. What else was I going to talk about? Another thing I wanted to talk about was analysis, because analysis is kind of glazed over. And I got a lot to fucking say about analysis as someone who did analysis for 2 years. Like I mentioned earlier, analysis is pretty low on my rung of things I have a lot of appreciation for. I kind of get where Ben was coming from, where he was saying that analysis can never surpass the work it was based on. I don't think surpass is probably the right word. I think what Ben was trying to say, or at least what I was taking from it, because it was something that I kind of agree with, is that analysis is always contingent upon other art to exist. It can't exist in a vacuum, right? You can't analyze nothing. So in order to analyze something, something else has to predate it, I guess is the word. Something needs to exist first in order to be analyzed. So it's always a reactive medium. It always has to be a reaction to something else. And that inherently makes it a response and never an initiation of creativity, if that kind of makes sense. I don't know if that's exactly the best way to word it, but it always has to come after something else. And I think that's what Ben was trying to get at. The red letter media thing he was kind of referencing when saying Star Wars is a good example of the analysis getting more kind of critical recognition than the work itself, though depending on the social circle you're in, the prequels are well loved by certain fanboys. But something I wanted to bring up when I was listening to that was the idea of analysis and cultural catharsis. Red letter media is a great example of that. How much of the reaction to that video was catharsis, right? Because there was a big gap between The Phantom Menace in 1999 and the red letter media video, which I think was like 2009, 2010. It wasn't very recent. It was a couple years ago, but there was a huge, at least I think a 10-year gap between Phantom Menace and the video. So there was 10 years of this like cultural buildup of like animosity toward this video. Like it initially came out. I was like in 4th grade at the time, so I loved it because I was a stupid little kid. But I'm assuming at the time there were adults who were kids watching the original Star Wars, watched it and felt betrayed by it, felt that it was a letdown. Obviously, people feel that way nowadays. I'm assuming at the time there probably was a group of people who were too. So there was a decade of just like built up animosity towards this trilogy and how it let them down and how it was just a different approach to the franchise than the original movies. So how much of the appreciation for the Star Wars reviews, and by extension analysis in general, is for the catharsis of having your ideas given a bigger outlet than just your mind, versus for the art itself. Because as someone who did analysis and someone who's friend with a bunch of people who do analysis and reviews and critique and stuff, I can appreciate the red letter media reviews on a technical level for what they're doing with the medium of analysis, even though I don't appreciate it as much as an art form. But I'm sure a ton of people don't think about that at all. They're just like, yeah, they're sticking it to these movies that I hate. So I think a lot of the love that eclipses the prequels probably comes from this just like jonesing for the fucking like verbal assault that they gave the prequels. Does that really count? I guess is my question. Maybe it does. But it seems like a lot of that comes from the catharsis and the feeling of, oh, I understand that, and that's how I feel, and he's saying exactly what I want to say, and it kind of almost feels like you're appreciating it because you're seeing yourself in it, and so therefore you're kind of pushing your ego into the piece because it's saying something that you wanted to say and something you already believe, versus your appreciation for the piece itself. Maybe another way of examining this point is talking about 4-panel comics that are prevalent on Tumblr, where they're like hashtags so relatable. You know, when there's a character and like their pet, and then life or some sort of life struggle is personified and shits on them or something, and like all the reblogs like, haha, this is me, hashtag me, and like people seem to, there's like a huge backlash against those now, especially against Owl Turds comics on Tumblr as of late, just because they're so redundant and done over and over again, and they appeal to a very kind of base concept of like, I'm going to point out something in life that is common and affects a lot of people, and you're going to look at it and you're not going to really see the work itself. You're going to project yourself into it and be like, haha, this is me. I like it because I see myself, not because I appreciate the work. And I feel like analysis sometimes can do that as well, where it's appreciated because of catharsis and not because of what it is. Okay, that went on a bit longer than I wanted. I got 5 minutes left to wrap this up before I gotta do my next round at work. Fuck. Analysis and dependency, critics and laziness. What was I even talking about with this bullet point? I don't remember. Critics and laziness. Fuck, I'm gonna have to cut this whole part out. I don't even remember what I was talking about with these bullet points. I wrote them like 3 hours ago. fuck, okay, so this is like an hour and a half, 2 hours later. I'm cutting this in because I remember what I meant by critics and laziness. Okay, so this is probably going to get me a ton of flack, but I don't fucking care because I think it's true and whatever. I think critics, too many critics, fall back to criticism because they're too lazy or feel they're too untalented to do the thing they're actually passionate about that they criticize. For example, I think a lot of people who do video game reviews and shit on YouTube probably really love video games and would make video games, but either think it's too hard or they're not talented or they just don't want to put in the effort to learn how to make games because that's really difficult, but they want to express their love for video games. So instead, they talk about video games. And I think because analysis is such a big thing in critique and reviews, and it's easy and you can make money doing it, and it's become this big thing because of YouTube, I think we're being deprived of a lot of people who make things because it's easier and more rewarding short term to talk about things that other people have already made. I think that's a huge fucking problem, and it's one of the reasons why I don't really do much reviews of media anymore, because I would rather spend the time that I spent making reviews, making things. You know, this is something that, I guess this is kind of like a personal tick that really resonates with me, is that when sometimes there are people who are legitimate critics, people who like actually want to be that, and that's what they want and nothing else. I think Digi is a great example, just off the top of my head, as somebody who actually legitimately likes and wants to be an analyst. I don't think if given the knowledge and the tool set to make anime, he would stop reviewing anime. I think that's his thing and that's what he wants to do. But there are a ton of people who aren't like that. And for me personally, that's what was kind of pissing me off, is that I'm talking about TV shows and I'm talking about movies and I'm talking about games, but I'm only doing it because I'm too lazy to get off my ass and actually make the things I'm talking about. And that's what I was doing before I got into YouTube, was that I was putting my money where my mouth was and where my passion was and trying to make the things. I don't want to talk about things that are cool. I want to be talked about as one of the things that are cool. That's what I'm really interested in. And I really hate how there are so many people who are doing analysis because they're too lazy to put in the legwork to make the thing that they're actually passionate about. I think there are so many people out there who would be making movies, who would be making games, who would be writing books, who would be making TV shows, who would be doing all these things, but it's just too hard, so they don't. And then they see people talking about the stuff on YouTube and like, oh, that's easy, I can just point a camera and talk about it, and look, the guy has 1 million subscribers and makes $100,000, I'm gonna do that. And then they do that, and we've lost another creator to the simple, easy returns of analysis and critique. And I really, hate me all you want, but I really think that because of YouTube has made analysis and review and critique and commentary way too big and has pulled people away from legitimate creation, I think YouTube is unfairly, like, it's almost too easy to make money with YouTube, and it's now too hard to make things doing things that actually require effort. It's like this reward effort is unbalanced right now. You should make more money quicker and more significantly when you do the hard work than the easy work, but that's not the way the system's set up right now. And I think that, combined with like just lack of confidence or lack of desire in people, you know, I actually want to make things and it's still fucking hard and I still haven't done anything of any significance yet. So I can't even imagine someone who like doesn't really have that drive. They're kind of sitting on the fence. Like, it's so fucking difficult. But like the tantalizing prospect of being the next nostalgia critic, a black nerd or red letter media, whatever, of just like just sitting there and talking about shit and getting all these accolades. I just think if put in a vacuum and asked, what would you want to do if the effort and the money and the time was no object and you could just snap your fingers and you would do one of these fields? I think a lot of people who are involved in criticism would say, like if it was no object, of course I would make a movie instead of talk about movies. Of course I would make a book instead of talking about books. Of course I would make a comic instead of talking about comics. And that's what's frustrating. That's why I think so much analysis comes from laziness. Too lazy to put in the time to be what you admire. Instead, you're just kind of talking about it. That's what I meant. That's just a huge problem with analysis. And that's kind of why, for me personally, I put it so low in terms of where I think it is artistically. Because I think so many people do it for the wrong reasons. And fuck that. I want to talk about books, because Munchie kind of tried to go on this fucking rampage about books. And I'm happy that Jesse and Ben both shut him down, because he's so fucking stupid saying that books are shit. Books are definitely not shit. But this is kind of like, I don't want to say a new revelation, but something I was reminded of by getting back into books in the last couple months. I used to read a lot in high school and not even high school. I used to read a lot in middle school and elementary school. By high school, I was reading mostly comics, because I think I had the same mentality that a lot of people do, and kind of maybe what Munchie sounded like, saying that like pictures are better than words. And that's kind of why I started gravitating towards comic books and manga away from books when I was a little kid. Because I liked drawing, I liked words, but I also liked pictures, and I liked pictures more. So I'm like, this has words and pictures, this has just words, I'm gonna go with words and pictures. But reading again, in the last like 2 or 3 years, as I've slowly started getting back into reading novels, there is a specific cadence, and a specific tone, and a specific way of storytelling that books have that cannot be replicated in other mediums. Books aren't just movies without a budget, is something that I think a lot of people don't realize or don't fully appreciate, is that a book is a very unique form of storytelling, because it allows a couple different things that I really appreciate. The first is that you can really get into a character's head in a way that you can't do in movies as much. Because movies have show don't tell. Books have show don't tell as well, but you have to show by telling, which is kind of weird, because all a book really is telling. It's like 300 pages of telling, but it's the way that you tell that makes it feel more like showing. So you can get into a character's head and really understand their thought process and get into their thoughts and their inner kind of workings as they go through situations that you can't do in a way that isn't heavy-handed in film. You can imply a lot of things with cinematography to a character's inner plight and stuff, but in terms of like a very like direct line into a character's thought process, books can do this more efficiently because they're nothing but writing. So you can like stop as you're describing something. You can describe the emotions and the thought process going through a character's head in between statements, because time flows a little bit differently, right? You're reading the book, and a book can have like a page that goes through like, 5 minutes of stuff, or another page that goes through like half a second as they think through a decision. You can't really do that with a movie, because a movie's running in real time consistently. Like, time can flow differently, but you as a passive viewer are experiencing it in real physical time, obviously, because you're sitting watching the movie. So like if a character is sitting there thinking about something for a minute, it's happening in a minute of real time, and the movie's kind of happening in that time as well. But if you're reading a book, it feels different. You're still experiencing it in real time, but the book for some reason allows that time to feel less disjointed, I guess. I guess also because like a book is read at your own pace, it doesn't really have a limit of like 2 hours approximately to really worry about. It can kind of meander a bit more, because page counts are much less consistent than movie times. But regardless, you can get into characters' heads, you can examine situations, and really break things down more than you can in movies. And another thing that I really like is you can engage all of the senses more specifically than you can in any other medium. Ironically, because there's less visual engagement. Like, describing things in books, like visual medium is very difficult to do in books compared to any other medium, because there are no visuals. Like, you have to sit there and describe things as opposed to just showing it in any other medium. And I would say that's books' biggest weakness, is that it can also be considered a strength from a certain perspective, that like you can envision the world however you want. It kind of stimulates your imagination a bit more. And I'd say that's a useful thing, but in terms of like objective like strength versus weaknesses in terms of like me as an author trying to tell you what something looks like. By me having to describe it with words, I can never be as accurate as it would be if I could just show you a picture of what it was. So that's a weakness of books. But on the flip side, every other sense can be stimulated secondhand just as eloquently, whereas something visually has to kind of go out of its way to kind of tell you about it. So for example, if I was going to sit here and describe the room I'm in, I could describe how it looked like. The room had a very ominous cadence because I'm sitting in an abandoned building with nothing else in here. One lighted room, looking outwards through 2 windows into a vast sea of blackness, sparsely lit by small lights scattered throughout the large room. The ticking of the clock kind of punctuates every minute of my time being wasted in here, not being able to do the things I actually want to do. The smell of the air smells of oil and dust and makes me cough. So I can jump between visual stimuli and like, you know, how something smells and how something feels and then how I think. I can do that all in the same kind of rhythm without ever breaking the flow of how a book works. Whereas if a film wants to describe how something smells, a character usually has to say, "Oh man, it stinks," you know, and very clearly like kind of stop whatever else is going on and say, "This is what this sense is being stimulated in this world," because all you can do is see it. But if I showed you a picture of the room that I'm sitting in, I can much more clearly give you the visual information than me describing it, because every one of you listening to this saw a different version of the room, and none of them were exactly the same as the one I'm actually sitting in. Whereas if I gave you a picture, everyone's perception would be the same. So books have strengths and weaknesses, but the point I'm trying to make here is that books are a work of art, or a medium of art that is unique. They do things that no other medium can, and they're not just like shittier versions of books or comics. That's all I got for this episode. I was going to make some other points, but I'm out of time. I'm already late for my next round, so this has been the Hyperbolic Wine Chamber. I've been drinking not wine, but if you want to give me wine for the next one, link is in the PayPal. Tell me what you want me to drink, and I'll go drink it. If you have suggestions for the podcast, let me know. Till next time, I'm Tom Oliver, and I'll be whining forever because I hate my life. I don't know how to end these yet. That's all I got.